She had plans, small ones, big ones. A life filled with love, with children, with days that should have stretched far into the future. A woman who laughed, who loved, who believed in second chances. And on an ordinary October evening, inside a quiet apartment in Seabrook, Texas, those plans shattered in an instant. No warning, no final words, just silence. The kind of silence that lingers, that fills a space where life should be. The kind of silence that, hours later, would be broken by the sound of footsteps, police officers stepping into a room where the truth lay still and unmoving. The details were unsettling. A mother found lifeless in her home, her 2 children inside, untouched, spared. A crime so sudden, so deliberate, that even the most seasoned investigators paused. A city that had seen its share of tragedy now found itself at the center of something deeper. And when the first reports hit the news, when headlines flashed across screens, the world saw only part of the story. A brutal crime, a young woman lost too soon. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't yet understand, was how every moment leading to that night was a thread in something larger. A decision made years before. A grudge that refused to fade. A story that didn't end with a single act, but stretched far beyond, reaching into the past, pulling at wounds that never really healed. What happens when vengeance waits? When patience isn't forgiveness, but a slow, quiet countdown? What happens when someone decides that the past doesn't stay buried, that retribution is owed, and that there's only one way to collect? Things are getting intense. If you're still watching, it means you love true crime content. Give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Born on October 6, 2000, in Seabrook, Texas, Mary Jayne Collins was a vibrant young woman known for her infectious smile and warm personality. Growing up in a close-knit community, she was cherished by friends and family alike. As a devoted mother, Mary Jayne's life revolved around her 2 young sons. She worked tirelessly to provide them with a loving and nurturing environment, often seen attending school events and community gatherings with her children. Dawayland Hurst, born in 2002, shared a complex relationship with his half-brother, Dawayland Triplet. Growing up in a turbulent environment, the brothers faced numerous challenges that forged a deep bond between them. Dawayland's adolescence was marred by a series of legal troubles, including charges of aggravated kidnapping and assault. These incidents painted a troubling picture of a young man grappling with a path leading deeper into the criminal underworld. Prior to the events of October 2024, he had a felony conviction for evading arrest in a motor vehicle in Galveston County. Court records also indicate prior convictions for evading arrest, possession of a controlled substance, and family violence-related offenses. Michael King and Mary Jayne Collins shared a significant chapter in each other's lives, marked by the birth of their son. However, their relationship took a dark turn when, in 2020, Michael was convicted for the murder of Dawayland Triplet, an act that would set off a chain of events leading to unforeseen consequences. Texas City, 2020. A night like any other, or at least it should have been. But for 24-year-old Dawayland Triplet, this night would mark the end of his story. A story that at first glance seemed ordinary. A young man navigating life, making decisions, and, like all of us, unaware of what the future had in store. But there was something happening in the shadows, conversations held in whispers, resentments quietly festering. And on this night, a single moment would decide everything. A bullet, a body, and a trail of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Dawayland Triplet was a son, a brother, a friend. To those who knew him, he was full of energy, ambition, and dreams. but he was also a man caught in the crosshairs of a world he might not have fully understood. On the night, he had no idea his final moments were closing in. He had spent his day moving through the usual motions, texting friends, making phone calls, checking in with family. There was nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at the storm waiting to strike. But something changed. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store shows him standing outside, waiting. For who? For what? That's the question investigators would later ask. Then a car pulls up, a conversation takes place. Less than an hour later, Dawayland Triplet would be dead. It was quick, brutal, final. Dawayland was found lying face down. The first officers on the scene described it as a targeted attack. Multiple gunshot wounds, no signs of struggle, no frantic escape attempt. Just a man, left behind in the cold, empty street. The gunshots rang out, but the silence that followed was even louder. Whoever had pulled the trigger had already disappeared. Texas City Police arrived within minutes, but there was no suspect in sight. No weapon recovered, no immediate clues left behind. But this was no random act of violence, no accidental crossfire. Someone had wanted Dawayland dead, and they had made sure it happened. Detectives began piecing together the events of that night. Who would want Dawayland dead? And why? The answer came sooner than expected. Investigators dug into his past, his associations, his conflicts. It didn't take long before a name surfaced, a name that had already made itself known to law enforcement. Michael King. King was no stranger to the system. He had a history, one that suggested he was more than capable of violence. But the key question remained: was he responsible for what happened that night? The evidence stacked against King was enough to move the case forward. Phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements. And then the trial began. The prosecution argued that King had a personal vendetta against Dawayland, that this wasn't just an act of random violence, it was a calculated execution. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They claimed there was no direct proof, no murder weapon, no DNA linking him to the scene. But the jury wasn't convinced. The verdict was read. Michael King was sentenced. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But this was only the beginning. Dawayland's family mourned, his friends grieved, and for most, this was the end of the story. But behind the curtain, another chapter was already being written, because someone had been watching, waiting, remembering. And 2 years later, the name Michael King would be spoken again. Not for the crime he committed, but for the one committed in his name, before the tragedy, before the violence, before the courtrooms and convictions. There was something else, a relationship, a history, a connection that started long before the events that would shatter everything. Mary Jayne Collins met Michael King in June 2024, and what began as a whirlwind romance quickly became something far more complex. On the surface, King was charming, attentive, a man who knew how to say the right things. He wasn't just her boyfriend. He was her protector, her provider, the father of her child. But behind closed doors, things were different. And as time went on, cracks began to show in their foundation. Toxic, a word that, in hindsight, feels like an understatement. Michael King wasn't just a boyfriend, he was a presence, controlling, possessive. And when he was arrested and convicted for the murder of Dawayland Triplet in 2020, Collins found herself standing in the wreckage of their life together. She was alone, a single mother, and for the first time in years, she had to navigate life without the man who had, for better or worse, dictated so much of it. At first she visited, brought their child to see him, but over time, the visits became less frequent. The calls went unanswered, the letters stopped. And then, Mary Jayne Collins moved on, or at least she tried to. Hurst had a past, a violent one. And while he wasn't yet known to the public in the way Michael King had been, those close to Collins saw the warning signs almost immediately. She wasn't safe. The signs were there, small at first, then escalating. But the patterns of abuse don't always disappear. Sometimes they just find new faces. Friends would later report that she spoke of arguments that left her shaken. She began withdrawing, making excuses for his behavior. That she stopped going out, stopped answering calls, stopped being herself. She reported it. Once, a single call to the police, a single record of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But as is too often the case, the report was just a piece of paper. And paper is easy to ignore. Mary Jayne Collins had become entangled in a cycle, one that many victims of abuse know all too well. The names changed, but the story remained the same. In the background of all this, there was another force at play. Michael King, locked away, had not forgotten about the world outside. He had not forgotten about Mary Jayne. He had not forgotten about Dawayland Triplet. And while the walls of a prison may keep a man inside, they do not silence him. Conversations were happening, orders were being given. And in the months to come, the past and present would collide in a way that no one could have predicted. Because what began with a murder in 2020, it was about to come full circle. And this time, the consequences would be even deadlier. Revenge is an ancient hunger, one that festers in the mind, consuming rational thought until nothing remains but the singular need to balance the scales. For Dawayland Hurst, revenge was not just an impulse, it was a duty, a belief, a cause he had convinced himself was righteous. His half-brother, Dawayland Triplet, had been murdered in 2020. And though Michael King had been convicted and sentenced for the crime, justice, true justice in Hurst's eyes, had never been served. Because the one thing Hurst could not ignore, the one thing that gnawed at him every single day, was her. Mary Jayne Collins, the mother of Michael King's child, the woman who had once been at King's side, the woman who, in Hurst's mind, had walked away from it all, free, unscathed, untouched by the weight of his brother's blood. Revenge is not just about anger. It is about perceived imbalance. The idea that someone has taken something from you that can only be repaid in equal suffering. In many cases, the target of that revenge is not even the person responsible, but rather someone associated with them. It's about sending a message, about making them feel the loss that you feel. Revenge is a dangerous thing. What do you think? Was this all premeditated, or was it an act of pure rage? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're here, subscribe for more gripping stories. Hurst's thoughts on revenge did not develop overnight. They were cultivated, fueled by years of resentment. And though Michael King sat behind bars, it was clear that his influence had not disappeared. In fact, it had only grown stronger. Was it King who planted the seed in Hurst's mind? Was it an orchestrated act of vengeance, or something Hurst had already decided to do on his own? The truth remains elusive. But what we do know is this. By the time June 2024 arrived, Dawayland Hurst had already made up his mind. Mary Jayne Collins was not going to walk away from this. At first, it was small things. Hurst would ask friends about Collins. He would track her movements, not openly but subtly, methodically. He learned where she shopped, where she took her children, who she spent time with. The obsession grew. He began showing up at places she frequented. Not close enough to be noticed, but close enough to watch. to linger. And then came the warnings, the whispered threats, the things that made Collins uneasy, made her tell her friends that something wasn't right. She didn't believe the system would protect her. She was right. Revenge killings are unique because they are not always about rage. More often than not, they are about calculation, about ensuring the victim understands why they are being targeted. It is a personal crime, intimate, direct. It's not just about taking the life, it's about making a statement. Hurst was not the first to let revenge consume him, and he would not be the last. But what makes his case particularly shocking is the way he justified it to himself. He believed he was correcting an injustice, that he was not a criminal, but an executioner, that Mary Jayne Collins's existence was an insult to his brother's death, and for that he had already written her fate in blood. It was no longer a question of if something would happen. It was only a question of when, and when the moment finally arrived. It was more brutal than anyone could have imagined. There are moments in a person's life when they can turn back, moments where a decision, even in its darkest form, can still be undone. But for Dawayland Ernest Hurst, that moment had already passed. By the evening of August 14th, 2024, he had crossed the threshold between contemplation and action. The choice was no longer being considered. It had already been made. In the days leading up to the murder, Hurst's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Collins' friends had noticed her growing anxiety. She had confided in them, saying she feared Hurst's temper, his unpredictability. But what terrified her most wasn't what he had already done. It was what she suspected he was capable of. It was the first undeniable sign that Hurst was not just threatening Collins. He was threatening everyone connected to her. When officers arrived at the scene, they didn't know what to expect. A domestic dispute, a robbery gone wrong. What they found was something far worse. Inside the home, officers found Mary Jayne Collins. She had been shot at close range. No sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. Her children, standing nearby, were unharmed. But the message was clear. Hurst had come for her, and her alone. Hurst was gone. By the time police arrived, he had vanished into the night. But the hunt had just begun. The human mind has a way of shielding itself from horror, from pain. But for the officers who stepped into Mary Jayne Collins's home that night, there was no protection. Mary Jayne Collins lay in the living room, her body still. She had been shot once in the chest, once in the abdomen, and once, execution style, to the head. Her children, huddled in the hallway, were untouched. A choice had been made. This was not a random act of violence. This was a message. When the crime was over, Hurst didn't panic. He didn't fumble or stall. He disappeared. It was almost as if he had planned his escape as carefully as he had planned the murder. The manhunt had begun. The search for Hurst stretched across 3 states. Tips flooded in, some credible, most not. But law enforcement had one major advantage. Hurst was running out of options. The name Dawayland Hurst was no longer just a police case. It was a national headline. Theories spread like wildfire. Some thought he had fled the country. Others believed he was hiding in plain sight. Every criminal believes they can outsmart the system until the moment they can't. Dawayland Hurst had run. He had hidden. He had watched as his name spread across news headlines, as his face was plastered on every television screen, as people whispered his name in hushed voices. But on the night of August 17th, 2024, his past finally caught up with him. It wasn't sophisticated police work. It wasn't high-tech surveillance. It was human nature. This wasn't just another arrest. This was a man backed into a corner, a man who had already killed, a man who had nothing left to lose. Hurst doesn't respond. He knows how this goes. He's watched enough movies. The second he steps outside, it's over. He had two options: surrender, or go out in a blaze of defiance. The door bursts open. The first officer moves in. A single shot rings out. A heartbeat skips. But the bullet never finds its mark. After 4 days on the run, after a nationwide manhunt, after all the blood and vengeance, Dawayland Hurst was caught. Not with a firefight, not with one last act of violence, but with a whisper, a tip, and the undeniable weight of justice catching up to him. Justice, however, is never truly the end. The damage was already done. 2 children, forever haunted by what they saw. A family shattered. A community left asking why. The death of Mary Jayne Collins sent shockwaves through her family, leaving a void that words could scarcely describe. Her parents, once pillars of strength, now found themselves grappling with an unimaginable sorrow. For her children, the loss was profound. Not only had they been robbed of their mother, but they had also witnessed the violence that took her away. The psychological scars ran deep. Seabrook, a town where everyone knew each other, was left reeling. The tragedy sparked a collective soul-searching, prompting urgent conversations about domestic violence and community responsibility. We must not let Mary Jayne's death be in vain. It's time to break the silence and take action against the scourge of domestic violence. The impact of such violence extends beyond the immediate family, casting a long shadow over the youngest members of the community. Exposure to domestic violence can lead to a host of developmental issues in children, including anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems. Determined to prevent future tragedies, the community rallied together, implementing support systems and educational programs. While the community's efforts provided a glimmer of hope, the path to healing for Mary Jayne's family remained fraught with challenges. The tragedy left an indelible mark on Seabrook, serving as a stark reminder of the pervasive issue of domestic violence. In the face of unimaginable loss, Seabrook found a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to protect its own and break the cycle of violence. The scars of domestic violence run deep, affecting not just the immediate victims, but entire communities. It begs the question, in a society that often turns a blind eye, how many more Mary Jaynes must we lose before we confront the darkness lurking within our own homes? Domestic violence, revenge, 2 forces that, when combined, almost always lead to a tragic outcome. Statistics don't just tell a story, they scream a warning. On average, a woman is killed by an intimate partner every 6 hours in the U.S. Over 60% of domestic violence victims who are murdered showed warning signs beforehand. In more than half of revenge-related murders, the perpetrator had a documented history of violent tendencies. And if history repeats itself, how many more will suffer the same fate? The lives of Mary Jayne Collins and Dawayland Hurst were intertwined through a series of complex relationships and past traumas. Mary Jayne's desire for companionship led her into a relationship that turned abusive, ultimately resulting in her untimely death. Hurst's unresolved grief and quest for vengeance culminated in actions that not only ended Mary Jayne's life, but also irrevocably altered his own. The hardest part about prevention is convincing victims that they are in danger before it's too late. Society tells them to endure, to hope things will change, to wait. But how long before waiting turns deadly? So what needs to change? Stronger enforcement of restraining orders, increased funding for domestic violence shelters, harsher penalties for abusers before escalation occurs, more education in schools on recognizing early signs of abuse and control. This case was solved, the guilty punished. The news cycle will move on. But will anything truly change? Or will we once again wait until another life is lost before we decide to listen? How many more warnings do we need? How many more tragedies before we stop seeing these stories as isolated incidents and start treating them as preventable horrors? And the most unsettling question of all, who will be next? This story is more than just a tragic crime. It's a wake-up call. Domestic violence, revenge, and unresolved trauma can destroy lives in an instant. If we don't talk about it, if we don't learn from it, history will keep repeating itself. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover and share real stories that need to be told.